History often remembers kings and emperors, but behind the thrones in the echoing halls of palaces, lived women whose voices were rarely heard yet whose influence shaped the course of empires. The queens of the Habsburg dynasty were more than symbols of elegance or tools of political alliance. They were thinkers, reformers, rebels, and survivors. Their lives, hidden beneath layers of myth and royal protocol, reveal stories of power, pain, ambition, and resistance that history has too often overlooked. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video, we'll delve into the untold stories of the Habsburg queens, behind the glamour. Join us as we covering back the gilded surface of imperial life and uncover the complex realities of these remarkable women who stood behind and sometimes in front of the throne. The Habsburg dynasty is one of the most influential and long-lasting royal houses in European history, reigning over vast territories for centuries and leaving a legacy still visible in the cultural, architectural, and political landscape of Europe today. From the Holy Roman Empire to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs were synonymous with power, diplomacy, and tradition. Emperors and kings bearing the Habsburg name often dominate the pages of history books, but the queens the women married into this dynasty or born into it often linger as background figures, defined primarily by their beauty, their children, or their proximity to male rulers. This narrative, however, is deeply incomplete. The real lives of Habsburg queens were complex, often fraught with pain, resilience, ambition, and struggle. Behind the glittering gowns and rigid etiquette of court life existed stories of survival, defiance, and forgotten influence that deserve to be brought back into the light. In the popular imagination, royal courts have long been seen as realms of elegance and enchantment, palaces gleaming with chandeliers, velvet-draped ballrooms filled with nobility, and lives unfolding like fairy tales. Habsburg queens in particular have been romanticized and idealized in films, historical novels, and museum exhibits. One of the most well-known figures, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, affectionately known as Sisi, has been frozen in time as a tragic beauty, a porcelain icon of melancholy grace. Yet even her story, widely told and retold, is often stripped of its raw truth. Her extreme efforts to maintain an idealized image, her obsession with physical perfection, and her desperate attempts to escape the suffocating rigidity of imperial life. Sisi was far more than a pretty face or a victim of circumstance. She was a woman of sharp intellect, poetic expression, and inner torment, a symbol of how reality was often at odds with the image imposed by dynasty and society. This contrast between myth and reality is not unique to Sisi. It is emblematic of how most royal women were treated by history. In many traditional accounts, queens are remembered for their marriages, the heirs they produced, or their occasional appearance in political ceremonies. Few narratives dive into their personal struggles, their behind-the-scenes influence, or the subtle and sometimes profound ways they shaped the political and cultural currents of their time. Many Habsburg queens were more than silent ornaments. They were active participants in dynastic strategy, key players in diplomacy, and the invisible force holding the sprawling and fractious empire together. Still, they were often limited by the gendered expectations of their roles, forced to navigate a world where their value was tightly bound to fertility, submission, and decorum. History, written largely by men and often filtered through nationalist or dynastic lenses, has long neglected these voices. In the case of the Habsburg queens, this neglect is especially pronounced. These women operated within a complex web of ceremonial obligation, court politics, personal repression, and shifting international alliances. They were subjected to extreme public scrutiny, especially concerning their appearances and reproductive roles, and often faced enormous psychological pressure. Some suffered in silence. Others found creative and courageous ways to push back. Some wielded real influence through patronage, letter writing, or court networks, while others lived in gilded isolation. In all these cases, their stories reveal the deeper truth of what it meant to be royal and female in early modern and modern Europe. The purpose of this exploration is to lift the veil to examine the Habsburg queens not as distant, idealized figures trapped in paintings and romanticized folklore, but as human beings with desires, doubts, intelligence, and agency. These were women who were born into or married into power but who rarely got to shape it on their own terms. Their legacies are layered and often contradictory. Some were conservative enforcers of the status quo, while others harbored radical ideas or resisted the roles forced upon them. Some sought spiritual solace in religion. Others found meaning in art, travel, or personal expression. By turning the spotlight on their untold stories, we begin to understand the empire not just from its male-centered public rituals, but from the private quarters, salons, gardens, and handwritten letters where so much of its real life took place. The Habsburg queens came from many backgrounds: Italian, Spanish, German, French, bringing with them different cultural influences, expectations and tensions. Each marriage represented not only a personal union but a diplomatic alignment, a merging of interests, and often a power struggle. These queens were expected to adapt, sometimes quickly, to unfamiliar courts, languages and customs. Their survival often depended on their political savvy, their ability to produce children, especially male heirs, and their capacity to remain publicly graceful while privately enduring heartbreak, illness, or alienation. In some cases, their pain was tragically visible. In others, it was quietly absorbed into the rigid machinery of dynastic continuity. As the Habsburg Empire expanded and evolved, so did the roles and challenges facing its queens. Some gained informal power by influencing their husbands or sons. Others stepped into the spotlight during periods of crisis. Queens like Maria Theresa broke the mold entirely, becoming sovereign rulers in their own right and challenging the very structures meant to contain them. Others, less known but no less significant, maintained the continuity of cultural and familial identity in the face of war, exile, and dynastic collapse. This video does not aim to create heroines out of every Habsburg queen. It does not seek to romanticize their struggles or turn them into modern-day feminist icons. Rather, it aims to tell their stories with honesty and complexity, to acknowledge both their complicity in systems of oppression and their resistance to the same, to highlight their influence not only in official records but in private acts of resilience, intellect, and emotion. By doing so, we offer a fuller portrait of a dynasty too often reduced to battles, treaties, and imperial egos. In recovering back the layers of myth, beauty, and ceremony, what emerges is a compelling, often heartbreaking account of what it meant to be royal and female in a world that gave with one hand and took with the other. These women's lives mattered not just as wives and mothers to great men, but as individuals navigating one of the most powerful and constraining systems in European history. Their untold stories deserve to be heard, remembered, and understood not only for what they reveal about the Habsburg dynasty, but for what they teach us about power, silence, and the human cost of empire. In the world of dynastic politics, the role of queens went far beyond ceremonial duties or the production of heirs. For the Habsburgs, whose empire stretched across vast and diverse territories in Europe, queens were essential instruments of diplomacy, statecraft, and power projection. The making of a Habsburg queen was not merely a matter of lineage or marriage; it was an intricate, calculated process deeply tied to the survival and expansion of the empire. These women were often born or chosen not just for their beauty or demeanor, but for the political capital they carried in their veins, the alliances they could forge, and the territories they might one day help control. From an early age, many noble girls destined to become queens were viewed primarily through the lens of political utility. Their value was rarely determined by their intellect or personal character but by the treaties their marriages could seal and the bloodlines they could connect. The Habsburgs, more than any other royal house, mastered the art of using marriage as a diplomatic weapon. Their famous motto, "Let others wage war, you fortunate Austria marry," was not an idle phrase. It was a guiding principle of state policy. Through a carefully curated web of marriages, the Habsburgs secured vast territories without unsheathing a sword. Spain, the Low Countries, Hungary, Bohemia, and parts of Italy all fell under their dominion through strategic unions. Queens in this context were frequently sent far from their homelands, often as young teenagers, to unfamiliar courts with different languages, customs, and expectations. Their education was designed with this future in mind. A potential Habsburg queen was taught languages, music, history, religion, and most importantly, the arts of etiquette, diplomacy, and subservience. Grooming was a meticulous process. Girls were trained to maintain composure under pressure, to speak eloquently yet cautiously, and to use silence as a political tool when necessary. They were expected to embody virtue, grace, and loyalty to the empire, becoming living symbols of unity between nations or rival factions. The emphasis on appearance and decorum was not mere vanity; it was a vital part of their role in a world where perception and image carried immense weight. While queens were often seen as passive players, many were in fact deeply involved in political affairs, both formally and behind the scenes. They wrote letters that influenced kings and emperors, hosted salons that shaped court opinion, and maintained relationships with powerful figures in their home countries. Some served as regents during times of war or succession crises, managing complex state affairs while their husbands were away or deceased. Despite these roles, their influence was often undocumented or minimized in official records, as direct political authority for women was viewed as transgressive. Their power was informal, relational, and often temporary, but it was nonetheless real. A compelling example of this dynamic can be found in the short but significant life of Maria of Burgundy. The only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, Maria inherited a vast and wealthy dominion that included the Burgundian Netherlands, Franche-Comté, and parts of modern-day France and Belgium. Upon her father's sudden death in 1477, Maria became one of the most sought-after heiresses in Europe. Her marriage would determine the fate of some of the continent's richest and most contested lands. At just 20 years old, Maria was thrust into a maelstrom of diplomatic intrigue and military pressure. King Louis XI of France moved swiftly to claim Burgundian territories through inheritance and force. Maria's advisors, understanding the threat, turned to the Habsburgs for protection and alliance. The result was her politically strategic marriage to Archduke Maximilian of Austria, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. This union was more than matrimonial, it was geopolitical. Through this single marriage, the Habsburgs gained a critical foothold in Western Europe, planting seeds that would grow into a continental empire in the following generations. Maria herself played a vital role in holding her territories together. She navigated internal rebellions, negotiated with recalcitrant nobility, and signed the Great Privilege, a charter that granted autonomy to her provinces in an effort to maintain loyalty. Despite being only briefly in power, she exhibited diplomatic skill and political intelligence that belied her youth. Her relationship with Maximilian, though initially formal and strategic, grew into one of genuine respect and cooperation. Together, they presented a united front against French aggression and worked to stabilize the fragmented Burgundian inheritance. Tragically, Maria's life was cut short in 1482 when she fell from her horse while hunting and succumbed to her injuries at the age of 25. Her death not only devastated Maximilian, who mourned her deeply, but also reshaped European politics. The Burgundian inheritance passed to her son, Philip the Handsome, linking the Habsburgs irrevocably to the Low Countries and setting the stage for the dynastic entanglements that would define the next 2 centuries. Maria's influence, though fleeting, was profound. She did not merely marry into power, she carried power with her and exercised it with purpose. Maria's story encapsulates many of the paradoxes faced by Habsburg queens. She was both a political pawn and an active agent. Her marriage was engineered by advisors for dynastic advantage, yet she embraced her role with intelligence and resolve. Her influence was significant, yet her contributions have often been overshadowed by the men who benefited from her alliance. This duality, being essential yet secondary, central yet sidelined, defined the experiences of many Habsburg queens. The making of a queen, then, was an elaborate process that involved much more than pomp and pageantry. It was an exercise in state-building, identity formation, and survival. These women had to reconcile their personal desires with political imperatives, often sacrificing autonomy for duty. They were the faces of unity in multicultural empires, the bearers of dynastic legitimacy, and the silent architects of continuity in times of upheaval. Their lives were rarely easy and seldom fully their own, but their roles were vital to the endurance of the Habsburg legacy. By understanding how queens were made, not just married, we begin to see the deeper systems at work in early modern European monarchy. We see how education, grooming, and political strategy intersected in the lives of young women who were expected to embody entire nations. We also see the cost of this expectation, the dislocation, the pressures, and often, the erasure of their individual stories from mainstream historical narratives. It is only by looking closer, by recovering voices like Maria of Burgundy's, that we can grasp the full complexity of royal power and the hidden labor behind imperial glory. The queens of the Habsburg dynasty were not merely symbols of alliance, they were participants in empire building, operating at the delicate intersection of diplomacy, duty, and identity. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, affectionately known as Sisi, was much more than a glamorous beauty icon. Her devotion to cosmetic perfection masked profound suffering, and the real story behind the myth reveals a woman tortured by mental anguish, driven by rebellion, and shaped by loss. From the moment she set foot in Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Sisi was caught between public expectation and personal despair. As a slender, Bavarian teenager, she was plucked from a free rural upbringing and thrust into imperial court life. Her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph was a diplomatic affair that soon became a gilded cage. Under the strict surveillance of Archduchess Sophie, her domineering mother-in-law, and confined by rigid ceremonies, Sisi often wept in public, struggling to adapt. A frightened bird, hidden behind pillows and tears as Sophie intruded even into her marital bed, Sisi's earliest days at court were defined by isolation and homesickness. To cope, she retreated inward, seeking control over the few aspects of life she could influence: her own body. Beginning a regimen that would take over her existence, Sisi subjected herself to hours of exercise each day in her private gym, rumored to be the first personal gym ever installed for a woman of her rank. Tight-laced corsets, secret fasting, and extreme beauty rituals such as bathing in olive oil or covering her face with raw veal and strawberries to preserve her youth. She refused portraits after turning 30, hiding behind fans and parasols, desperate to arrest the passage of time. Her obsession wasn't vanity, it was survival. In a court where her value was tied to appearance and fertility, Sisi responded to pressure with silence and self-erasure. Her weight hovered around 110 pounds. At one point, her waist measured just 16 to 19 inches. Psychologists analyzing her records today suggest she suffered from anorexia nervosa, labeling her habits a restrictive eating disorder. But more profound than the disorder was the need to reclaim bodily autonomy in a life otherwise controlled by diplomacy, decorum, and dynastic obligations. She had 4 serious pregnancies in quick succession. The death of her eldest daughter Sophie in 1857 triggered a severe breakdown. Sisi refused food, withdrew emotionally, and began to disappear from public functions. Her illnesses were not just physical. Coughing fits, anxiety, and bouts of melancholia plagued her, leading doctors to advise prolonged absences from court, often seeking solace through travel. Her poems and diaries, locked away until decades later, reveal a sharp intellect and deep disillusionment with imperial life. She wrote of monarchy as outdated, compared herself to Titania, and expressed regret for her gilded cage. "Oh, had I but never left the path. I have awakened in a dungeon with chains on my hands." Her writings show a woman aware of her suffering and suffused with the desire for liberation, yet fearful to reveal her true beliefs to the public or court. Sisi's mental torment and external imagery became inseparable. She traveled constantly to Madeira, Corfu, Hungary, Switzerland, seeking relief from stifling court life. In Hungary, she found her most genuine welcome and played a key role in the creation of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, earning deep gratitude from the Hungarian people. Yet, her cosmetic perfection persisted. Cold showers, gym machines, veal masks, hair rituals lasting hours, each act both a balm and a self-inflicted torment. Behind the cultivated image lay deep heartbreak. The 1889 suicide of her only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, traumatized Sisi. Already fragile, she sank into despair, cloaking herself in black and avoiding court entirely. She traveled aimlessly, often alone, and immersed in mourning. In her grief-driven solitude, she even received medical treatment with cocaine for depression and spoke of suicide. Her tragic end came in 1898 when Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini assassinated her in Geneva, stabbed in the heart while her face was distracted by a parasol. Her death symbolized eternal vulnerability, an icon immortalized in death, but whose life had been shaped by perpetual escape. To the public, Sisi remained the tragic beauty, celebrated in romantic films like the 1950s Sisi trilogy. These portrayals emphasized her elegance, her loving marriage to Franz Joseph, and fairy tale images of palace life. Yet they shied away from the darkness she lived, the alienation, anorexia, depressive spiral, and authoritarian oppression of her in-law. Modern reappraisals like Bridget Hammond's biography The Reluctant Empress and corrective historical dramas reveal a woman at war with public spectacle and private demons. Netflix's recent series The Empress has reignited global interest, presenting a stark, psychologically attuned portrait, though it still mixes reality with fiction. Viewers see a vulnerable young bride crying at her carriage and hugging cousins instead of bowing, moments based on fact. The show underscores parallels to modern icons like Princess Diana, obsessed with beauty, trapped in royal rituals, and suffering in silence. Yet even historical dramas simplify. They omit the depths of Sisi's depressive episodes, her secret cocaine use, her literary rebellion, and her intermittent acts of political agency, like her behind-the-scenes support for Hungarian autonomy. They frame tragedy as aura rather than reality. The truth is more fractured and profound. A woman whose physical discipline reflected inner torment, whose search for beauty masked psychological breakdown, whose rebellion was expressed in silent poetry, clandestine travel, and subtle influence in dynastic politics. Empress Elizabeth, tragic emblem of resilience and fragility, exemplifies the tension between image and reality in royal narratives. Her legacy endures in modern Austrian spa culture, perfumes, and hairstyles inspired by her rituals. But beyond those echoes is a cautionary tale: the human cost of aesthetic pressure, confinement, and expectation. Sisi's life reminds us that behind the glamour was a woman suffering and resisting, an empress who used beauty as armor, travel as refuge, poetry as confession, and death as the only escape she could not avoid. In the end, the real Empress Elizabeth is not just the tragically beautiful figure of folklore, but a deeply complex individual, brilliant, broken, rebellious, and profoundly human. Maria Theresa was an extraordinary figure, the only woman to reign over the Habsburg dominions in her own right. She ruled not as a passive consort but as an active monarch deeply engaged in the geopolitics of her time. When her father, Charles VI, died in October 1740, she immediately invoked the Pragmatic Sanction, the decree that ensured her succession despite Salic law. Yet powerful neighbors Prussia, Bavaria, France refused to accept a female ruler and launched the War of the Austrian Succession. At just 23, Maria Theresa found her inheritance under direct threat. Her armies invaded Silesia, Bohemia, and parts of Italy, and only her will and skilled diplomacy saved the core of her realm. Within months she personally appealed to the Hungarian Diet, famously finding unexpected allies among Hungarian nobles who rallied to her cause. Clad in traditional court dress with sword in hand, she won their support not only with rhetoric but courage, and the Hungarian army, marked by heart-shaped patches, marched to uphold her claim. Though the war dragged on until 1748, ending in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle with Silesia lost to Prussia, Maria Theresa nonetheless emerged as the legitimate ruler of almost all Habsburg territories. This victory was not merely military, it was dynastic and symbolic, an assertion that she would not cede to the gendered limitations imposed upon her. While navigating the chaos of war, she also maintained a large family. Married since 1736 to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, later Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, living largely in her shadow, the couple had 16 children, of whom 10 survived to adulthood. Her offspring included the future Joseph II, Marie Antoinette, who became France's ill-fated queen, and Leopold II. As a mother, she was famously devout and disciplined. She once wrote, "I can never have enough children," and oversaw their strict and comprehensive education. Her reproductive zeal was partly strategic, ensuring dynastic continuity, but it also displayed genuine affection and hope that her family would reinforce Habsburg influence across Europe. Alongside familial devotion, Maria Theresa was deeply religious, but this piety carried a harsh edge. A devout Catholic influenced by Jansenist rigor, she saw religious unity as essential for political stability. Protestants were heavily persecuted, and though she initially tolerated some degree of religious diversity, she reversed course. Expulsions of Jews, 20,000 from Prague alone, were ordered in 1744, and Protestant dissenters were marginalized or forcibly converted. She even established a chastity court to punish moral offenses such as adultery, prostitution, and sodomy, sentencing offenders to whipping, deportation, or death. Her intolerance marked a darker aspect of her reign, reflecting the moral strictness she believed necessary for an empire under divine order. Militarily, Maria Theresa's reign was defined by near-permanent war. After the War of the Austrian Succession, she refocused her energies on reforming the army, doubling its size, modernizing its structures under ministers such as Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz and Friedrich Wilhelm von Haugwitz to prepare for the looming threat posed by Prussia. When the 7 Years' War broke out in 1756, she once again sought to recover Silesia, forming alliances with France and Russia. Although Prussia retained its prize, Maria Theresa secured Austria's position and maintained its honor. Simultaneously, she enacted sweeping internal reforms. Recognizing that a stronger state required modern institutions, she overhauled the tax system to reduce estate privileges and increase revenue, centralized administration, built a functional civil bureaucracy, standardized weights and measures, and invested in commerce, reducing internal tariffs and opening access to Trieste port. The judicial system was reformed, torture abolished in 1776. She instituted compulsory primary education for both boys and girls in 1774, founded the prestigious Teresa Number Academy for civil servants, and encouraged inoculation against smallpox, personally championing the cause after surviving the disease herself. Vienna blossomed as a cultural capital, hosting courts filled with Haydn and Mozart and undergoing civic improvements like the Berg Theatre, Stock Exchange, and Schönbrunn Palace enhancements, all overseen by Maria Theresa herself. Her religious conservatism was tempered by administrative innovation. She subordinated church power to the state, evicting the Jesuits in 1773, controlling clerical appointments, and limiting papal influence, yet her intolerance toward religious minorities remained unmitigated. Even so, she eventually scaled back violent expulsions and allowed some protections for Jewish communities in later years. The final decades of her reign featured more diplomatic maneuvering. The first partition of Poland in 1772 gained Galicia and Bukovina, The War of Bavarian Succession in 1778–79 resolved with only minor territorial gain but reinforced Austria's diplomatic standing. She ruled jointly with her son Joseph II after Francis I's death in 1765, a relationship often fraught with tension, as Joseph's Enlightenment ideals clashed with her pragmatism. Though she resisted some of his radical proposals, she ensured a stable transition by making him co-regent and guiding reforms to preserve Habsburg authority even beyond her death on November 29, 1780. Maria Theresa's dual legacy is layered. On one hand, she is revered as the Übermutter of the Habsburg monarchy, matriarchal figure who stabilized dynastic rule and centralized state power. On the other, her moral absolutism inflicted suffering on religious minorities and enforced rigid control. However, her reforms laid the foundations for modern Central Europe: a centralized administration, compulsory schooling, a restructured military, improved healthcare, and a cultural renaissance. Her careful balancing of war politics, family strategy, and domestic modernization earned her recognition as arguably the architect of modern Austria and the greatest reforming ruler of 18th-century Europe. Maria Theresa defied the rules, not only those that barred women from power but also the inertia of feudal empire. She wielded maternal strength to harness dynastic loyalty, nurtured state-building vision to shape institutional modernity, and held firm moral conviction to preserve imperial unity. Her life was a testament to the complex interplay between tradition and transformation, piety and policy, motherhood and monarchy. In a world dominated by male rulers, she claimed authority in her own right and in doing so, reshaped the course of Central European history. In the vast and ornate history of the Habsburg dynasty, attention tends to fall on the most visible and mythologized figures, empresses like Maria Theresa or Elizabeth, Sisi, while others have been nearly erased from public consciousness. These silent queens did not leave fewer footprints. They were simply less heard, their stories quietly buried beneath layers of gendered historical narrative, dynastic overshadowing, and the political priorities of their time. Figures such as Eleonora Gonzaga and Claudia de' Medici held roles of considerable cultural, administrative, and dynastic importance, yet remain marginal in popular accounts of Habsburg history. Exploring their lives allows a deeper understanding not only of the women themselves, but also of the machinery of historical memory that silences certain voices while amplifying others. Eleonora Gonzaga, for instance, was the second wife of Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor, and played a prominent role in the cultural and religious life of the Habsburg court in the early 17th century. Born into the influential Gonzaga family of Mantua, Eleonora was well educated and deeply involved in the arts. She was instrumental in introducing Italian Baroque aesthetics and Catholic Counter-Reformation influences into the Habsburg cultural sphere. Her patronage helped foster music, architecture, and religious theatrical performance in Vienna. Under her influence, the imperial court saw a flourishing of sacred music and visual arts, with composers such as Giovanni Valentini and Antonio Bertoli gaining prominence. She helped commission architectural projects, decorated chapels, and was a staunch supporter of the Jesuits. Despite these accomplishments, Eleonora remains a peripheral figure in Habsburg narratives. Her lack of biological children, coupled with her role as a second wife, likely contributed to her limited recognition. In a court culture that prized dynastic fertility and political alliances through marriage, women who did not bear heirs were often sidelined, no matter how active or impactful they were in public life. Eleonora's story, while rich in artistic and spiritual significance, lacked the dynastic drama or battlefield consequences that historians of empire often seek. Yet her influence on the religious and cultural tone of the Habsburg court was profound, shaping how Catholic identity was projected in a tumultuous period of Protestant-Catholic conflict. Another example is Claudia de' Medici, a member of the powerful Florentine family and later the regent of Tyrol. Born into the Medici dynasty in 1604, she married Archduke Leopold V of Austria-Tyrol, a match that strengthened alliances between two of Europe's most influential ruling houses. Following Leopold's death in 1632, Claudia assumed the regency on behalf of her underage son, Ferdinand Charles. In this position, she governed Tyrol with a firm and competent hand, managing fiscal and military matters during the difficult years of the 30 Years' War. Claudia proved herself as a skillful and pragmatic ruler, issuing decrees, maintaining loyalty among the Tyrolean estates, and ensuring her son's smooth succession. She was also an important cultural patron and is credited with enhancing the court's artistic life, as well as maintaining economic stability in a time of conflict. Her governance demonstrated that female political agency was not only possible but effective in a period dominated by male-dominated councils and martial authority. And yet, Claudia de' Medici, like Eleonora Gonzaga, remains an obscure figure. The reasons for this erasure are manifold. For one, her role was defined as regency, a transitional and, in the eyes of many chroniclers, temporary position that served merely to safeguard male succession. Furthermore, her Italian origins and association with the Medici sometimes cast her as a foreigner in Austrian narratives, an outsider who did not fit neatly into national histories. Her achievements were often framed in terms of maternal duty rather than political skill, minimizing her contributions to statecraft. The stories of such silent queens reveal the broader mechanics of how women's roles in history are remembered or forgotten. In the royal courts of Europe, queens were often defined by their proximity to power rather than their exercise of it. If they bore heirs, their success was marked. If they married strategically, their usefulness was noted. But when queens ruled directly, governed as regents, or influenced court life through patronage, their actions were frequently dismissed as auxiliary, domestic, or symbolic. One of the core reasons these women were sidelined lies in how history has long been written largely by men, for men, and about men. Traditional historiography prioritized wars, treaties, territorial conquests, and succession crises, arenas in which women were assumed to be passive participants, or at best background actors. Queens who wielded soft power through culture, diplomacy, religion, or regency were not seen as engaging in real politics. Their labor was rendered invisible or recast in gendered terms such as maternal wisdom, devotion, or moral influence, which reduced complex political strategies to personal traits. Moreover, the limited access women had to publish memoirs, write political philosophy, or hold formal titles outside of marriage further contributed to their historical marginalization. Many of these queens operated through indirect channels, advising their husbands, managing court appointments, handling estates, or working behind the scenes in religious or artistic spheres. These were powerful positions but rarely recorded with the detail or reverence granted to kings and generals. There is also a linguistic erasure at play. Words like regent, consort, and queen mother often denoted temporary or secondary roles, and historical documents were less likely to preserve the personal voices of these women unless they left extensive letters or memoirs. Those who did, like Maria Theresa or Elizabeth, left clearer records and stronger public images. Others, who were perhaps equally impactful but more circumspect, faded from view. What remains of women like Eleonora Gonzaga or Claudia de' Medici must often be reconstructed from court records, patronage receipts, ecclesiastical documents, and scattered references in diplomatic correspondence. They exist more as silhouettes than statues, more in the margins than the main text. However, recovering their stories is not simply an act of restoration, it's a redefinition of what counts as power. Their lives challenge the assumption that political influence must be loud, visible, and male-dominated. They offer a model of leadership that blends domestic responsibility with administrative acumen, and cultural refinement with political pragmatism. They remind us that influence can be wielded from chapels and salons as much as from thrones and war rooms. These silent queens were not silent at all. History simply chose not to listen. Today, with shifting methodologies and a more inclusive lens, we can begin to reconstruct their voices, faint, perhaps, but firm, and reinsert them into the broader tapestry of European history. Not as footnotes to their husbands' achievements, but as figures of agency, intellect, and legacy in their own right. When the Habsburg Empire finally collapsed at the end of World War I, it marked the end of centuries of imperial dominance in Central Europe. The dynasty that had ruled vast swathes of territory stretching from Hungary and Austria to Bohemia and parts of Italy crumbled under the pressure of military defeat, rising nationalism, and revolutionary unrest. In the immediate aftermath of the 1918 armistice, the imperial court disintegrated, its once gleaming prestige reduced to scattered possessions, uncertain titles, and political irrelevance. At the heart of this final chapter stood Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. Her story, one of loyalty, displacement, and quiet defiance, embodied the emotional and symbolic toll of the dynasty's fall. Zita was born into the Bourbon-Parma family, a cadet branch of the Spanish Bourbons, with deep connections to European aristocracy. Educated in multiple languages and raised in an environment of devout Catholicism, Zita was well prepared for the expectations of royal life. In 1911, she married Archduke Charles of Austria, the grandnephew of Emperor Franz Joseph I. When Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914, setting off the chain of events that led to the First World War, Charles became heir presumptive. Following the emperor's death in 1916, Charles ascended the throne as Emperor Charles I of Austria and King Charles IV of Hungary. Zita, just 24 years old, became empress of a rapidly disintegrating empire in the midst of global conflict. From the outset, Zita took her role seriously. Unlike many royal consorts, she was actively involved in state matters. She attended military briefings, met with political leaders, and advised her husband on policy. Her political insight was respected, sometimes feared by those at court. She encouraged Charles to seek a negotiated peace during the war, and her correspondence with her brothers who served in enemy armies led to the ill-fated Sixtus Affair in 1917. This secret attempt to broker a separate peace between Austria-Hungary and the Allies, using Zita's brother Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma as an intermediary, backfired when it was made public, and irreparably damaged Charles's political credibility. By 1918, the empire was fragmenting under internal pressures. Nationalist movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia declared independence. The army was disintegrating, and revolutionary fervor spread through Vienna and Budapest. Charles, under mounting pressure, renounced participation in state affairs in both Austria and Hungary in November 1918 but never formally abdicated. Zita famously declared, "A sovereign can never abdicate. He may be forced to renounce the exercise of power, but he cannot give up the throne." This statement, spoken with conviction, signaled the couple's belief in divine right monarchy even as the world around them moved irrevocably toward republicanism. With revolutions spreading and their personal safety at risk, the imperial family fled Austria in March 1919, escorted by British troops. They first settled in Switzerland, moving between modest villas and guest houses. Their life in exile was a stark contrast to the splendor of the Habsburg and Schönbrunn palaces. The family often struggled with poverty, relying on support from monarchist sympathizers and private donations. Zita gave birth to her 8th child in exile, navigating the demands of motherhood without the resources of empire. Charles made 2 unsuccessful attempts to regain the Hungarian throne in 1921. After his second failure, the couple was exiled to Madeira by the Allied powers, a remote and impoverished island that symbolized the depth of their political isolation. Life in Madeira was harsh. Their villa was poorly heated and food was scarce. In 1922, Charles contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 34. Zita was widowed with 7 young children, alone in a foreign land, dependent on charity and scattered royalist networks. Her resilience in the face of this profound loss was striking. She wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, a symbol not only of her grief but of her continued fidelity to the monarchical cause. Despite the hardship, Zita never gave up on her belief in the legitimacy of the Habsburg claim. She raised her children, particularly her eldest son, Otto, with a strong sense of dynastic duty. She instilled in them the belief that the monarchy had served as a stabilizing force for Central Europe, and that its fall had led to chaos and war. Zita moved to Spain, then Belgium, and eventually settled in Luxembourg and later the United States during World War II, escaping the Nazi invasion of France. In exile, she continued to act as a figurehead for Habsburg monarchists, giving interviews, writing letters, and attending diaspora events. Her testimony of World War I, particularly her reflections on the fall of the monarchy, became part of the larger narrative that cast the Habsburgs as victims of external aggression and internal betrayal. She criticized the Treaty of Saint-Germain for dismembering the empire and blamed nationalist leaders for destabilizing a system that had, in her view, protected minorities and maintained peace. In her memoirs and letters, she presented a consistent and romanticized vision of the Habsburg legacy, one of duty, sacrifice, and misunderstood benevolence. Over time, her image softened in the public eye. By the 1980s, as Cold War Europe reassessed its past, there was a resurgence of interest in imperial history, particularly in Austria. Zita, by then in her late 80s, began to receive more sympathetic attention. Her dignity, intelligence, and enduring loyalty to her late husband made her a figure of quiet admiration. While she never returned to live in Austria, the ban on her family's re-entry was lifted in 1982, and she visited the country briefly. Upon her death in 1989 at the age of 96, she was buried in the Imperial crypt in Vienna alongside Charles, her final return to the dynasty she had fought so hard to preserve. Zita's life offers a compelling portrait of a queen in exile, not simply a displaced aristocrat, but a woman of conviction and strength who navigated the disintegration of a world order with both sorrow and resolve. Her commitment to the Habsburg legacy, even in the face of political irrelevance and personal tragedy, reflected a deeply rooted belief in the sacred nature of monarchy. At a time when most royal families were adapting to modernity or fading quietly into ceremonial roles, Zita stood apart as a symbol of defiance. She did not modernize, rebrand, or retire. She simply endured. The fall of the Habsburg Empire was not just a political event, it was a personal catastrophe for those who had lived at its center. For Zita, it meant loss of homeland, status, and husband, but also the chance to embody an older, more unyielding model of queenship, one that combined personal sacrifice with dynastic loyalty. Her story challenges the notion that royalty loses relevance once thrones disappear. In Zita, the crown may have been removed, but the monarch remained. Religion played a central and inextricable role in the Habsburg monarchy, not merely as a spiritual belief system but as an organizing principle of power, legitimacy, and identity. For Habsburg queens, Catholicism was both a personal devotion and a political instrument. Their status as consorts or sovereigns in an empire that styled itself as the defender of the Catholic faith shaped their public image, daily lives, and historical roles. These women did not merely adhere to the Church's teachings, they became its champions, patrons, and in some cases enforcers. Through religious patronage, support for clerical orders, and influence over ecclesiastical policy, Habsburg queens exercised a form of agency that was deeply embedded within the framework of divine kingship. The concept of divine queenship in Catholic Europe was grounded in the idea that monarchs ruled by God's will and were charged with the spiritual welfare of their subjects. A queen, as the spiritual companion to the king, shared in this sacred duty. She was expected to embody piety, virtue, and maternal care for the nation's soul. For many Habsburg queens, this role was not ornamental but active. Their identities were entwined with the defense of the Church, and their influence was often directed toward shaping the religious tone of the court and broader society. One significant arena of female religious influence was the patronage of monasteries, churches, and convents. Habsburg queens donated lands and funds to religious institutions, commissioned chapels and altarpieces, and often chose to be buried in richly endowed church settings. These acts were not only demonstrations of faith but also deliberate exercises in legacy building and spiritual authority. By sponsoring religious orders, queens could cultivate networks of clerics who would offer prayers and masses on their behalf, securing both their personal salvation and their dynastic memory. Eleonora Gonzaga, wife of Ferdinand II, was known for her deep religious devotion and patronage of Baroque religious culture in Vienna. She supported the Jesuits, helped to construct new religious buildings, and introduced sacred music into the Imperial chapel. Her efforts aligned with the Catholic Counter-Reformation's goals of reaffirming Catholic grandeur and reasserting religious authority in response to Protestant reform. Through these actions, Eleonora was not merely expressing her private piety, she was engaging in a calculated use of religious spectacle to reinforce Habsburg power and Catholic identity at a time of deep confessional division in Europe. Queens also held considerable sway in ecclesiastical appointments and religious policy. Although they lacked formal political office, their proximity to the monarch gave them access to discussions and decisions on matters of faith. Their confessor priests, spiritual advisors, and religious allies often became influential voices at court. These queens used their status to advocate for specific orders, doctrinal stances, and anti-Protestant measures. They were instrumental in sustaining the Habsburgs' image as defenders of the faith and suppressors of heresy. Maria Theresa is a particularly striking example of a queen who wielded religious power assertively. Deeply devout, she saw her Catholicism as a core element of her rulership. Her reforms in the church-state relationship were paradoxical. On one hand, she curbed the power of the papacy over internal ecclesiastical matters, but on the other, she was a staunch promoter of Catholic orthodoxy within her realm. She suppressed Protestant communities, limited Jewish freedoms, and expelled the Jesuits when their political influence threatened state interests, only to later support their educational mission through different means. Her religious policies were not merely expressions of belief, they were tools of consolidation, shaping a unified and loyal population through shared faith. The support of specific religious orders, particularly the Jesuits, was a common thread among many Habsburg queens. The Jesuits, with their strong educational and missionary focus, were seen as ideal partners for promoting dynastic authority and spiritual conformity. Queens funded Jesuit colleges, oversaw the production of devotional literature, and used Jesuit advisors to counsel their children. Their advocacy extended into diplomacy as well, supporting Jesuit missions abroad in places like the Americas and Asia as part of the broader imperial vision of spiritual conquest and moral stewardship. Yet this alignment with religion was not without political consequences. The Queen's promotion of Catholic values often put them at odds with local populations and rival powers. In the multi-ethnic Habsburg lands, Protestant communities especially in Hungary, Bohemia, and Transylvania resented the aggressive Catholicization campaigns led in part by royal women. These efforts were sometimes seen as foreign impositions, and queens were viewed as agents of a centralizing, intolerant imperial power. Their religious interventions, while framed in spiritual terms, had clear political ramifications, stirring unrest, fomenting rebellion, or undermining regional autonomy. However, within the Church, queens often had a more nuanced relationship with power. They could serve as mediators, protectors, or reformers. In many cases, they advocated for religious women nuns, abbesses, and lay sisters whose voices were otherwise ignored by the male-dominated hierarchy. Queens intervened in convent disputes, defended women's right to spiritual authority, and encouraged female education through monastic institutions. In doing so, they expanded the space for women's leadership within the religious sphere and reinforced the interconnectedness of female piety and governance. Their influence was also visible in the realm of ceremony and symbolism. Through liturgical performances, royal processions, and feast day observances, queens enacted a visible and powerful form of religious devotion that helped shape the political culture of the empire. Their participation in these rituals was not passive. It signaled their integral role in the sacral monarchy. Whether kneeling at a Marian shrine, walking barefoot in Holy Week ceremonies, or commissioning processional regalia, Habsburg queens bound themselves and their dynasty to divine order. Over time, the role of queens in religious life changed alongside shifts in European politics and ecclesiastical authority. Enlightenment rationalism, secular nationalism, and revolutionary movements in the 18th and 19th centuries diminished the Church's absolute control over state matters. Yet even as monarchies waned, the idea of the Catholic queen retained symbolic power. The last Habsburg empress, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, continued this legacy in exile. Her personal piety and commitment to Catholic tradition lent moral weight to the Habsburg cause, even after the empire had disappeared. She maintained ties with religious communities, gave interviews on the spiritual dimensions of monarchy, and remained a model of Catholic queenship long after political power had faded. The religious roles played by Habsburg queens illustrate a complex blend of belief and strategy, devotion and ambition. Their faith was not simply a private matter, it was a public performance and a form of influence. In a male-dominated political system, queens found in religion a sphere where they could exert authority, shape discourse and leave lasting legacies. Whether through funding a chapel, lobbying for an ecclesiastical appointment, or leading public acts of worship, these women contributed to both the spiritual and political architecture of the Habsburg realm. Their agency, however framed by faith, was real. It functioned within the constraints of doctrine and gender but was no less potent for that. Religion gave Habsburg queens both the stage and the script to wield power in a way that conformed to contemporary expectations while quietly pushing their own agendas. In doing so, they left an indelible mark on the religious and cultural fabric of Central Europe. In the gilded courts of the Habsburg dynasty, the female body was not simply a matter of personal existence, it was a vessel of dynasty, symbolism, and statecraft. Queens and empresses were expected to embody not only the virtues of piety and obedience but also the physical ideals of fertility, beauty, and health. Their appearance, reproductive capacity, and public comportment were all scrutinized with an intensity that reflected their central role in the continuity and perception of the empire. Far beyond private life, their bodies became tools of diplomacy, propaganda, and political performance, sometimes at the expense of their physical and mental well-being. Marriage within the Habsburg dynasty was often a transaction of dynastic interest rather than personal choice. Queens were selected not just for their lineage but for their physical appeal and presumed ability to produce heirs. A youthful, healthy appearance suggested fertility, and fertility meant security for a succession line in a fragile political landscape. Women entering these marriages knew that their bodies would be under constant observation not just by their husbands, but by court physicians, courtiers, and the public. Their menstrual cycles, pregnancies, and recoveries were matters of political import, and failure to conceive or to deliver a male heir could create crises of legitimacy or even provoke diplomatic tensions. The expectation of repeated childbirth dominated the lives of many Habsburg queens. Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg lands, gave birth to 16 children, balancing her imperial responsibilities with the demands of almost continuous pregnancy. Each successful birth was celebrated with fanfare, but miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths were deeply felt and sometimes publicly mourned. These losses were not only personal tragedies but also perceived failures in their duty to the state. Reproduction was not a private act, it was a performance that had to yield results. The pressure to bear healthy sons often led to anxiety, exhaustion, and physical decline. For many women at the Habsburg court, pregnancy was constant and hazardous. With the absence of modern obstetrics, childbirth was fraught with danger. Death in childbirth was a very real threat, and so was the physical toll of bearing multiple children in quick succession. Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, for example, had 4 children but struggled deeply with the loss of her daughter Sophie at a young age and with the control over her children's upbringing, which was assumed by her domineering mother-in-law. While she met the basic expectations of fertility, her deep emotional distress revealed the darker side of this reproductive burden. The queen's bodies were political instruments even outside of motherhood. Their physical appearance played a significant role in court culture and diplomacy. Portraits of royal women were circulated across Europe as part of marriage negotiations or displays of dynastic prestige. These images were carefully curated to show beauty, elegance, and regal poise, often smoothing imperfections or exaggerating desirable features. The Habsburg court maintained specific ideals of feminine beauty, often drawn from prevailing European standards: pale skin, a slender waist, delicate hands, a long neck, and controlled yet opulent fashion. Queens were expected to conform to these ideals, reinforcing not just aesthetic standards but moral ones. Beauty was linked with virtue, and a queen who failed to uphold this visual perfection might be viewed as deficient in character. Empress Elizabeth became an extreme embodiment of this idealized femininity, devoting much of her life to maintaining a near-mythical standard of beauty. She spent hours daily on her hair, kept a strictly controlled diet bordering on starvation, and used elaborate skin treatments to preserve her youthful appearance. While her looks earned admiration and lasting fame, the psychological cost was high. Her obsession with thinness, combined with depression and anxiety, turned beauty into a form of self-punishment rather than empowerment. Her case illustrates how courtly standards of female perfection could become instruments of torment, trapping women in endless cycles of self-scrutiny and bodily discipline. In contrast, queens who were considered physically unattractive or who failed to project elegance were often diminished or sidelined in court life. Judgments about their appearance could influence their political clout, their social standing, and their legacies. Even in historical memory, beauty or the lack thereof played a role in how these women were remembered. Some queens were reduced to caricatures, their complexities erased by the simplicity of visual appraisal. For example, some Habsburg princesses, notably in Spanish branches of the dynasty, were painted with exaggerated jawlines and elongated faces, features that later became symbols of Habsburg inbreeding, obscuring the lived experiences and individual stories of the women themselves. Infertility, real or rumored, was perhaps the most perilous condition a queen could face. A childless consort threatened the stability of the dynasty and could provoke suspicion, disdain, or efforts to replace her. Some queens who suffered repeated miscarriages or stillbirths found themselves under immense pressure, not only emotionally but politically. Whispered accusations of sin, divine punishment, or witchcraft sometimes emerged in court circles, turning private suffering into scandal. The emotional toll of such experiences, particularly in a time when medical understanding was minimal, was profound. Women bore the blame even when the cause was unknown or unrelated to them. Despite the expectations placed on their bodies, many queens sought to reclaim a measure of agency. Some turned to spiritual practices, immersing themselves in religion as a means of coping with physical and emotional demands. Others used fashion, poetry, or correspondence to express aspects of their identity that went beyond motherhood or appearance. In rare cases, queens intervened in medical or health-related matters, insisting on certain treatments or resisting dangerous birthing practices. These actions, though constrained, reflect efforts to assert control in a world where their physical presence was endlessly politicized. Ultimately, the pressure on Habsburg queens to perfect their bodies to be beautiful, fertile, and flawless was not merely about personal standards but about maintaining a system built on symbolic continuity and visual power. Their bodies became the physical site where the expectations of empire, faith, and patriarchy converged. They were celebrated, critiqued, and manipulated in the service of dynastic goals, often at great personal cost. What remains striking is how little freedom these women had in the management of their own bodies. Every movement, every change in appearance or health, every pregnancy and every loss was monitored, interpreted, and judged. And yet, through all this, many queens endured, adapted, and even resisted, quietly asserting their humanity in the face of impossible expectations. Their stories remind us that the image of regal perfection often hides a world of suffering, sacrifice, and unseen strength. Life at the Habsburg court was a constant dance of power, loyalty, and competition, with queens, archduchesses, and noblewomen maneuvering through a highly stratified social and political system. Far from being passive figures draped in jewels and protocol, many Habsburg queens and their counterparts wielded significant influence through relationships, informal networks, and personal alliances. At the heart of this dynamic world were the ever-shifting relationships among royal women themselves, relationships shaped by ambition, duty, familial loyalties, and sometimes deep personal resentment. Rivalries and alliances among queens, sisters-in-law, mothers-in-law, and noblewomen were not just matters of personality, they had tangible consequences for court politics, diplomatic policy, and even imperial succession. Sibling rivalry and interhouse competition were inevitable in a dynastic world where marriage meant political union and power sharing. Many queens came from noble houses in competition with one another: Spain, Bavaria, France, the Italian principalities, and were married into the Habsburg family to serve strategic purposes. These women often carried their original loyalties into the Habsburg court, and the memory of family rivalries or geopolitical tensions lingered beneath the surface of even the most courteous social interactions. While queens were expected to embody unity and submission to the emperor's authority, the pull of their natal families often complicated this expectation. A queen from the Bourbon family might find herself at ideological odds with other members of the court allied with Hohenzollerns or Protestant nobility. If her birth family had a history of conflict or competition with the Habsburgs, she might be viewed with suspicion, regardless of her personal conduct. This dynamic became especially complex when multiple noble houses were represented in the court at the same time, each vying for influence, representation, and the emperor's favor. Women often became the political and symbolic stand-ins for these broader conflicts. Within the court, women formed their own power centers through friendships, patronage, and backroom diplomacy. Queens and duchesses maintained salons and private audiences where decisions were influenced, reputations shaped, and alliances cemented. These informal networks were especially important for women who lacked formal political authority. A well-placed word in a private conversation or the cultivation of loyalty among ladies-in-waiting could prove as consequential as a public decree. Queens often supported each other or undermined each other by placing relatives and loyalists in positions at court, influencing their husbands or sons, or lobbying behind the scenes on behalf of certain political causes. These networks were not always harmonious. Rivalries between queens and other high-ranking women could be fierce, often heightened by competition for influence over the emperor, control of court etiquette, or the right to shape the upbringing of royal children. The case of Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, and her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, remains one of the most famous examples of such rivalry. Sophie was the epitome of Habsburg conservatism, strong-willed, politically savvy, and utterly devoted to maintaining the old imperial traditions. When Sisi, a young and idealistic Bavarian princess, married Emperor Franz Joseph, Sophie quickly assumed control of many aspects of her life, especially her role as a mother. Sophie dismissed Sisi's youthful ideas and claimed authority over her children, believing the young empress too naive and fragile to raise them properly. She had them placed under her own care, causing a deep emotional rift between the women that lasted for decades. Sisi, in turn, came to resent her mother-in-law's control and sought escape from the rigid formalism of court life, traveling constantly and avoiding Vienna whenever possible. Their clash was not simply personal. It reflected a generational and ideological conflict between tradition and modernity, control and independence. Sisi's rebellion against the Habsburg structure and Sophie's tenacious grip on it created a symbolic tug-of-war that would shape the imperial court's atmosphere for years. But rivalry did not always mean hostility. There were also powerful alliances forged among royal women, some of which proved crucial to diplomacy and domestic stability. When queens found common cause through shared family origins, mutual respect, or common enemies, they could become effective collaborators. These alliances allowed women to protect each other from political isolation, advance shared religious or cultural agendas, or coordinate efforts in court intrigue. One such form of cooperation occurred in the arena of backroom diplomacy. Women often acted as intermediaries between their birth families and their marital courts, passing messages, facilitating negotiations, and advocating for policy positions in subtle but impactful ways. They hosted visiting dignitaries, arranged social functions that doubled as diplomatic forums, and used their personal relationships to shift political balances. In this way, queens and noblewomen blurred the lines between personal loyalty and statecraft, using the tools available to them: empathy, persuasion, performance to shape outcomes behind the scenes. The court environment fostered these dynamics by its very structure. It was a world of hierarchy, ritual, and scrutiny, but also one of intense intimacy. Women lived in close proximity, attended the same religious services, participated in court ceremonies, and navigated the same expectations of appearance, behavior, and social grace. This closeness could generate profound bonds, but it could also breed envy, rivalry, and resentment. A queen who was more beautiful, more beloved by the emperor, or more politically adept might quickly attract the jealousy of her peers. Rumors and gossip, common currency at court, could be deployed as weapons in these rivalries, damaging reputations or influencing perception in subtle ways. Even beyond the palace walls, queens could become rivals in the cultural imagination. Their portraits, public appearances, and reported activities were compared and contrasted in diplomatic reports and court commentary. Their popularity with the people or the press could influence their status at court. A queen who became a symbol of national identity or religious devotion might eclipse others who were equally powerful behind the scenes. Thus, public perception fueled by storytelling, portraiture, and court theater was another battleground for rivalry and alliance. At times, these dynamics extended across generations. A daughter-in-law might take revenge for a slight suffered by her own mother years before. Sisters married into different royal families could find themselves in opposing camps during wartime, forced to navigate the tension between blood loyalty and national allegiance. The emotional and political entanglements were endless, as personal stories intertwined with geopolitical narratives in a world where female relationships mattered as much as treaties. The Habsburg court was as much a stage of female strategy and agency as it was one of male diplomacy and power. Rivalries and alliances among queens and noblewomen formed an invisible architecture beneath the empire's glittering surface. These relationships shaped dynastic decisions, influenced imperial policy, and often determined the personal happiness or misery of the women themselves. Behind every ceremonial facade was a world of calculated choices, delicate negotiations, and enduring tensions, reminding us that in the palaces of Europe, the most consequential intrigues were often whispered from one woman to another. The private letters, diaries, and memoirs of Habsburg queens offer a rare and intimate glimpse into lives often obscured by ceremony, myth, and official history. While their public roles demanded stoicism, perfection, and political loyalty, these personal writings reflect unfiltered moments of vulnerability, grief, longing, and inner resistance. Stripped of their formal titles and courtly obligations, these queens emerge in their own voices as women grappling with loneliness, emotional distress, family conflict, and the weight of dynastic expectations. Far from mere historical curiosities, these documents challenge the polished images imposed on them by the empire and by later historians. Personal correspondence was often one of the few ways royal women could speak honestly about their circumstances. In the rigid Habsburg court, where surveillance was constant and even family relationships could be political minefields, letters served as an emotional lifeline. Whether addressed to mothers, siblings, close confidants, or spiritual advisors, these letters reveal the emotional texture of royal life, the feelings rarely seen in official portraits or ceremonial accounts. In them, queens complained of loneliness, wept over the deaths of children, expressed despair about their marriages, and sought refuge in philosophical or religious reflection. One of the most revealing letter writers was Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi. Her letters, often melancholy and poetic, reveal a deeply sensitive woman trapped in a world she did not choose and could not control. In her private notes, she wrote about her physical and emotional exhaustion, her yearning for personal freedom, and her revulsion toward the rigid structure of the Viennese court. She described the pain of being separated from her children, the suffocating presence of her mother-in-law, and her sense of alienation from the role she was expected to play. These writings directly contrast the public image of Sisi as an ethereal beauty or fairy tale empress. They humanize her, placing her squarely in the context of mental health struggles and emotional trauma. Diaries serve a similar function. In them, queens process the isolation and tension of court life away from judgmental eyes. The act of diary writing itself was often therapeutic, a small domain of personal control in lives otherwise dictated by court etiquette and political strategy. Some queens kept meticulous records of their thoughts, daily routines, and emotional fluctuations, providing historians today with invaluable insights into their inner worlds. Their entries reveal an ever-present balancing act between personal pain and public performance. Maria Theresa, despite being a politically formidable ruler, left behind writings that show moments of profound emotional vulnerability, particularly after the deaths of several children. Her notes reveal a woman who believed deeply in her divine mission but who also agonized over whether she had been a good mother. She prayed fervently for guidance, recorded her feelings of guilt and sorrow, and expressed weariness with the constant burdens of governance. Her writings dismantle the image of a purely iron-willed monarch, showing her as a mother, widow, and woman who lived with chronic grief. These private voices, however, were not always allowed to speak freely, even posthumously. Historians, biographers, and political figures often selectively quoted or edited these documents to suit ideological narratives. In some cases, letters were censored or destroyed by family members who feared that the raw emotion or politically sensitive content might tarnish the family's legacy. Others were interpreted through the lens of moral or nationalistic agendas, reducing complex emotional lives to cautionary tales or idealized martyrdom. Empress Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Habsburg empress, left behind letters that conveyed her suffering in exile, her unshakable loyalty to her husband Emperor Karl, and her attempts to maintain dignity amid immense loss. But for decades, her image was shaped less by her own words and more by political mythmaking, either as a stoic symbol of monarchical endurance or as an irrelevant remnant of a fallen age. Only more recently have her private writings begun to influence how she is remembered, as a woman of courage, sorrow, and enduring emotional strength. Beyond the royal courts, letters exchanged between noblewomen, archduchesses, and even attendants also illuminate the emotional dimensions of life in proximity to power. In their words, we find expressions of jealousy, friendship, homesickness, and resistance to arranged marriages. These letters often contain coded language or indirect references, as writers were aware their mail could be intercepted or scrutinized. Still, they provide a textured view of court society from multiple perspectives, offering insights into how women supported or sabotaged each other, coped with trauma, and imagined alternative futures. What is perhaps most striking in this personal writing is the recurring theme of emotional contradiction. Royal women expressed gratitude for privilege and luxury while simultaneously describing emotional emptiness. They celebrated their children while mourning the constant pressure to reproduce. They affirmed religious faith while questioning their purpose and destiny. These tensions reveal the psychological toll of living lives so heavily choreographed by others. Mental health, though not named as such in their time, was a frequent undercurrent. Descriptions of melancholia, anxiety, disordered eating, insomnia, and existential despair appear repeatedly in these texts. Elizabeth's obsessive routines, her need for solitude, her dread of aging, and her refusal to be photographed in later years all point to a woman under immense psychological strain. Others describe deep depression after childbirth, anxiety over dynastic succession, or the numbing repetition of public duties. Modern readers can recognize in these writings the symptoms of mental illness, trauma, and burnout. Yet in their own time, these expressions were often dismissed as hysteria, weakness, or even arrogance. Consequently, many queens suffered in silence, their emotional distress pathologized or erased. Their true voices, complex, contradictory, and emotionally rich, are only now beginning to be fully acknowledged by scholars willing to read beyond the official story. The letters and diaries of the Habsburg queens serve as both historical sources and acts of quiet rebellion. They reclaim agency in a world that so often tried to speak for them. These writings do not just fill in the gaps of imperial history, they challenge the very way that history has been constructed. They insist on the humanity of women who were too often turned into icons, caricatures, or footnotes. In returning to these personal texts, we rediscover the queens not as distant emblems of power or tragedy, but as individuals who felt deeply, struggled constantly, and wrote truthfully. Their voices, long silenced or manipulated, offer one of the most powerful correctives to the myth of the invulnerable, ornamental queen. They are, in every sense, letters from the past that speak urgently to the present. In the Habsburg court, fashion was far more than an aesthetic concern, it was a visual language of hierarchy, duty, and control. Dress codes were strictly regulated, and every detail of a queen's wardrobe, from the cut of her gown to the jewels she wore, carried symbolic weight. Clothing announced status, allegiance, religious piety, and imperial authority. For Habsburg queens, fashion became both a performance of power and, at times, a subtle or overt act of resistance. It was an essential part of how these women navigated their roles, how they were perceived by others, and how they expressed their individuality within the constraints of an empire that demanded conformity. At court, elaborate rules governed what royal women could wear and when. Fabrics, colors, accessories, and even hairstyles were carefully prescribed. Black, for example, was associated with mourning but also with dignity and tradition, and was frequently worn by dowager empresses or deeply devout queens. Gold and crimson signified majesty, and were reserved for formal events or major religious celebrations. Lace, embroidery, and pearls denoted refinement, while more restrained attire might indicate humility or piety. These unspoken codes turned queens into walking symbols of the state, with their bodies becoming the stage upon which political and dynastic messages were displayed. Queens were expected to model ideal femininity through their dress, elegant but modest, beautiful yet unthreatening. Their gowns were often designed to reinforce traditional gender roles: restrictive bodices, voluminous skirts, and delicate fabrics that inhibited physical movement. This style projected grace and fragility, aligning with the idea of queens as nurturers, intercessors, and ornaments of power rather than wielders of it. Yet even within this highly managed system, queens could exert influence through what they wore, using fashion to support political causes, promote their natal cultures, or distinguish themselves within a crowded court hierarchy. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or Sisi, is perhaps the most vivid example of fashion as both conformity and rebellion. In her early years at court, she fulfilled the expectations placed upon her. Her beauty and sartorial elegance were tools for imperial propaganda, carefully cultivated through rigorous routines and public appearances. She wore the latest Parisian designs, accented with Habsburg regalia, and became a style icon across Europe. Her famously intricate hairstyles and tightly corseted waist maintained through extreme dieting and hours of preparation created an almost mythic image of empress as fairy-tale princess. However, as Sisi grew older and increasingly alienated from the Viennese court, she began to reject its fashion codes. She withdrew from public life, refused to be photographed, and abandoned many of the elaborate gowns that had once defined her image. She began wearing simple black dresses, often devoid of the expected jewels and emblems of royalty. Her black garments, while ostensibly mourning attire, were also a statement of distance and refusal. They signaled her detachment from imperial duty and her grief not just over personal losses but over the role that had suffocated her spirit. This choice unsettled the court, which relied on her image as a symbol of continuity and grace. In rejecting that image, Sisi was quietly but powerfully asserting her autonomy. Her fashion choices also extended into travel. When journeying far from court on her frequent visits to Corfu, Madeira, or Hungary, Sisi dressed practically, sometimes in riding trousers or masculine-cut jackets. In those settings, she could be anonymous or at least less constrained by imperial expectations. These shifts in clothing reflected her internal transformation and her desire to craft a personal identity separate from the imperial apparatus. Other Habsburg queens used fashion to signal diplomacy and cultural allegiance. Through their dress, they honored their countries of origin or the regions they governed. Maria Theresa, for instance, occasionally wore traditional Hungarian elements in her attire, especially when addressing Hungarian nobles or attending events in the region. These fashion choices were strategic visual affirmations of unity with different parts of her diverse empire. They helped soothe tensions and express solidarity, reinforcing her image as a monarch who ruled not just from Vienna but from across Central Europe. At the same time, queens were aware that fashion could be used to control them. Their wardrobes were scrutinized not just by courtiers but by the public, whose perceptions of legitimacy and femininity were shaped by these visual cues. A queen who dressed too plainly might be seen as neglectful of her role. One who appeared too flamboyant might be criticized for vanity or extravagance. The balance was delicate. Every public appearance was a performance, and the costume was as important as the script. Despite these pressures, fashion could offer moments of creative self-expression. Some queens became patrons of designers, supported local textile industries, or experimented with styles that merged court tradition with evolving European trends. Others found small acts of defiance in choosing a forbidden accessory, adjusting a hemline, or adopting a signature color. These minor decisions, almost invisible to outsiders, were ways to assert identity and personal taste in a world that rarely allowed them full autonomy. The clothing of the Habsburg queens was never just fabric or ornament. It was a battleground of identity, expectation, and control. Through their dress, these women signaled loyalty, mourned losses, displayed wealth, or quietly rebelled. Whether wrapped in pearls or clad in black, they used fashion not only to fulfill the demands of empire but to carve out a space however narrow for their true selves. Within the tightly choreographed world of the Habsburg court, love was rarely a matter of personal choice, particularly for queens. Marriages were arranged for political expediency, Alliances were struck to preserve dynastic interests, and romantic affection was often sacrificed in the process. Yet behind the formal images of duty-bound empresses and obedient archduchesses, there existed a web of emotional relationships, some romantic, some platonic, and some scandalous, that revealed the deep human needs of women trapped in gilded cages. The story of Habsburg queens is not merely one of crown and ceremony, but also of unspoken desires, private betrayals, and the quiet ache for connection in lives dominated by spectacle and isolation. Most Habsburg queens entered their marriages with little say in the matter. These unions were brokered by diplomats and monarchs, often years in advance, and their success was measured less by intimacy than by political harmony and reproductive output. Queens were expected to produce heirs, support their husbands publicly, and remain discreetly silent about any emotional or physical dissatisfaction. The reality of loveless or strained marriages was common, though rarely acknowledged openly. In such a climate, queens sometimes sought emotional or even physical intimacy outside their official partnerships, though always at great personal risk. Empress Elizabeth of Austria Sisi provides one of the most layered examples of this dynamic. Her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph was strained from early on. Though he was deeply devoted to her, she never returned the intensity of his affection. Isolated from her children, criticized by her mother-in-law, and stifled by court ritual, Sisi withdrew emotionally and physically. Rumors circulated about her close friendships with men like the Hungarian statesman Gyula Andrássy, with whom she shared a deep intellectual and emotional bond. While there is no definitive evidence that their relationship turned romantic, the depth of their connection suggests a closeness that bordered on the intimate. For Sisi, who often fled Vienna in search of freedom and solace, such relationships may have been essential to her emotional survival. Other Habsburg consorts were less circumspect, and their rumored affairs became subjects of intense court gossip and diplomatic concern. These liaisons, whether real or fabricated, could tarnish reputations and destabilize already fragile marriages. In the hyper-observed world of royalty, where women's behavior was judged against impossible standards of purity and obedience, even a whiff of scandal could have profound consequences. Empress Maria Leopoldina of Austria, who married Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, faced such scrutiny. Her husband's blatant infidelities were tolerated and even politically managed, but when she expressed unhappiness or independence, she was seen as unstable and difficult. Similarly, Maria Luisa of Spain, wife of Emperor Leopold II, was the subject of speculation due to her animated personality and rapport with certain courtiers. These suspicions, though unproven, fed into a pattern of moral double standards where men could indulge in affairs without consequence, but women faced exile, humiliation, or historical erasure for even the suggestion of impropriety. Platonic yet emotionally intense relationships also played a vital role in the lives of Habsburg queens. In a court environment where trust was rare and genuine companionship even rarer, close friendships often substituted for romantic intimacy. Letters and diaries reveal affectionate, sometimes desperate attachments to female confidants, ladies-in-waiting, and family members. These relationships could be deeply fulfilling, offering solace and understanding that eluded their formal roles as wives and mothers. In some cases, such friendships were tinged with homoerotic undertones, though they were rarely framed that way at the time. Court rumor mills, however, were quick to sensationalize such closeness. Jealous rivals or political adversaries could exploit these relationships, using them to question a queen's loyalty or stability. A bond that provided emotional survival could be weaponized into scandal. As such, queens walked a fine line between expressing personal affection and maintaining the strict decorum required of their station. In a world where every gesture could be interpreted as a political statement, even private emotions had public ramifications. At times, forbidden desires spilled into the open with disastrous results. The consequences varied depending on the political landscape and the personality of the ruling emperor. For some queens, even suspected infidelity could result in social exile or house arrest. Others managed to navigate these situations more delicately, protected by their family connections, personal charm, or the discretion of their partners. The tension between public virtue and private longing created a double life for many queens. On the surface, they performed the expected roles of consort, mother, and moral exemplar. Behind closed doors, they wrote letters full of yearning, confided in their attendants, and found small pockets of freedom where they could express their true selves. The constant suppression of their desires took an emotional toll. It manifested in physical ailments, depression, anxiety, and in some cases, self-destructive behavior. For these women, survival often depended on their ability to keep their inner lives hidden, to maintain a careful equilibrium between what they felt and what they were allowed to show. Scandal, for a queen, was not merely a personal crisis, it was a national one. Her behavior reflected on the dynasty, and a misstep could be exploited by political enemies. Yet scandal was also a form of power. It could be used as a weapon to bring down a rival, or as a bargaining chip in dynastic negotiations. Queens who were suspected of infidelity or inappropriate attachments were often portrayed as dangerous or unstable, regardless of the truth. This served the dual purpose of punishing them for their independence and reinforcing the image of the obedient consort as the only acceptable model of queenship. Nevertheless, the very persistence of these stories, whether proven or speculative, points to the deep emotional hunger that permeated the lives of many royal women. Their capacity to love, to form deep attachments, and to dream of more than what was allotted to them, did not disappear under the weight of protocol. Instead, it often found expression in private letters, coded diaries, and whispered conversations, testimonies to a side of their lives rarely acknowledged by official histories. The romantic and emotional lives of the Habsburg queens. We are reminded that beneath the layers of silk and ceremony were women with human needs, desires, and heartbreaks. Their stories challenge the sanitized portraits handed down through generations and reveal the resilience required to preserve any sense of self in a world designed to suppress it. Whether through secret love, quiet companionship, or whispered rebellion, these queens carved out space for emotional truth in a life where almost everything else was dictated by duty. In the grandeur of Habsburg courts, art was not only a display of luxury and taste but a calculated expression of power and cultural identity. Queens, though often overlooked in official historical narratives, played a vital role in shaping the artistic legacy of the Habsburg Empire. Through their patronage, personal tastes, and alliances with renowned artists, composers, and architects, these women became influential cultural architects. They used the arts to construct their public images, reinforce dynastic prestige, and, at times, express their own private yearnings and intellect in ways that were otherwise restricted by their political roles. While emperors controlled the military and political gears of the empire, queens and empresses often controlled its soul. Their investment in the arts extended beyond decorative refinement. It was a form of diplomacy, identity assertion, and legacy building. Art, music, and architecture sponsored or inspired by queens contributed to the grandeur of court life, elevated the Habsburg name across Europe, and immortalized their visions in fresco, marble, and melody. Through these mediums, queens could subtly shape ideologies, affirm religious values, and influence public morality without overtly challenging the patriarchal order. One striking example of cultural patronage was Eleonora Gonzaga, an Italian-born Habsburg empress known for her deep commitment to the arts. Trained in the sophisticated Renaissance courts of Italy, she brought with her a passion for opera, ballet, and Baroque music. Under her influence, the Viennese court evolved into a thriving cultural hub that began to rival other European capitals. She supported lavish court performances, encouraged the import of Italian musicians and dancers, and helped lay the groundwork for Vienna's eventual dominance in the world of classical music. The Queen's engagement with the arts was often both personal and political. Their patronage reflected not just their taste, but their roots, religious values, and ideological commitments. Queens used visual and performing arts to assert their individuality, promote the Catholic Church, and model appropriate female behavior. Portraiture in particular was a crucial tool. Images of queens dressed in elaborate regalia or pious simplicity communicated messages of authority, virtue, and dynastic continuity. Artists such as Martin van Matens and Diego Velázquez were commissioned to capture these carefully constructed personas, creating a blend of realism and idealization that echoed in court halls and diplomatic exchanges. Many Habsburg queens were also deeply involved in music patronage, a tradition that reached its zenith in the 18th century with figures like Maria Theresa. Though she is better known for her political reforms and military leadership, Maria Theresa was also a passionate supporter of music. Her court became a fertile ground for composers such as Christoph Willibald Gluck and, later, Joseph Haydn. She recognized music as both a tool for diplomacy and a means of fostering cultural cohesion in her sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. Haydn, in particular, thrived under Habsburg patronage, composing symphonies and chamber works that were performed at court concerts and private gatherings. His compositions elevated the court's cultural standing and offered queens a way to cultivate refined domestic spaces that mirrored their ideals of harmony, order, and beauty. Although Maria Theresa was said to be critical of some forms of operatic excess, her reign marked a golden age in Viennese music, which influenced generations of composers and patrons to follow. The younger generations of Habsburg royals continued this legacy, including interactions with rising musical geniuses like Mozart. While Mozart famously struggled with court politics and failed to secure a long-term position at the Habsburg court, his operas and concerts were nonetheless attended and supported by members of the imperial family. Queens and archduchesses frequently hosted salons and soirees that allowed music to flourish in more intimate settings. These private performances, far from the spectacle of state functions, allowed royal women to nurture their own creativity and interact more personally with the arts. Artistic patronage was not limited to music and painting. Architecture also bore the imprint of Habsburg queens. Many were involved in commissioning churches, palaces, and charitable institutions whose design reflected their personal piety or dynastic pride. Baroque and Rococo architecture flourished under their guidance, often emphasizing religious grandeur, Marian devotion, and feminine symbolism. These buildings served both public and private functions, reinforcing the queen's roles as moral guides and cultural leaders. The construction of convents and chapels, often endowed or designed by royal women, linked them to divine authority and projected their legacy into future generations. Despite their immense cultural contributions, many queens had to carefully balance their creative impulses with the expectations of decorum and self-effacement. Publicly they were supposed to be muses, not creators. Their engagement with the arts was framed as noble support rather than intellectual ambition. Yet personal diaries and letters suggest a more active role, one of critique, taste, and inspiration. Some queens composed music, painted, or wrote poetry themselves, although much of this work remained hidden or attributed to others. Their private creativity, expressed through embroidery, musical interpretation, or artistic correspondence, reveals an interior world that was rich and thoughtful, even if it rarely made it into the historical spotlight. The duality between their public image and private creativity was often stark. A queen might be celebrated for commissioning a chapel or founding a ballet school while quietly writing reflective verses on aging, loneliness, or spiritual struggle. The arts thus became not only an external expression of power but an internal refuge. In moments when political engagement was denied to them, artistic patronage offered an alternative form of influence, a way to shape culture and memory on their own terms. The cultural legacy of the Habsburg queens is woven into the very fabric of Central European identity. Through music, painting, architecture, and performance, they left behind a world that bore the subtle imprint of their tastes, beliefs, and emotions. Their patronage did not merely adorn the empire, it helped define it. In preserving and promoting art, these queens ensured that even when their political voices were muted, their aesthetic vision would resonate through centuries. In the glittering courts of the Habsburg Empire, queens and consorts often moved through the corridors of power with deliberate subtlety, working from the margins of formal governance while leaving a lasting imprint on politics and diplomacy. Although official structures rarely granted them overt authority, these women influenced major state affairs, navigated factional rivalries, and steered international negotiations through personal relationships, correspondence, and family networks. The narrative of Habsburg rule is incomplete without acknowledging the behind-the-scenes maneuvering by royal women whose counsel, charisma, and calculated silence helped shape the trajectory of European politics. Political influence among Habsburg queens operated primarily through informal channels. With no constitutional role or seat at the council table, these women relied on proximity to power, particularly through their relationships with emperors, ministers, and foreign royals. Their status as wives, mothers, or sisters of monarchs granted them access to sensitive information and decision-making processes, and their influence was often wielded in private salons, family discussions, and quiet interventions rather than public decrees. This lack of visibility, far from minimizing their impact, often protected them from direct accountability and allowed their political strategies to unfold in less obstructed ways. Maria Theresa stands as an exceptional case. Though she was a sovereign ruler in her own right, she also functioned within the traditional expectations of queenship, leveraging the roles of wife and mother for political advantage. Her reign was one of constant warfare, internal reform, and dynastic ambition, and her daughters became key pieces in her grand strategy to secure the Habsburg position in Europe. She personally oversaw their education and prepared them for politically advantageous marriages, turning them into emissaries of influence embedded within foreign courts. Perhaps the most famous of these daughters was Marie Antoinette, married off to the future Louis XVI of France. While her legacy is often associated with excess and revolution, her placement was initially intended as a diplomatic bridge between Vienna and Versailles. Her letters to her mother and brother Joseph too reflect the political pressures placed on her to serve not just as Queen of France, but as a de facto agent of Habsburg interests. Despite her youth and naivety, Marie Antoinette was expected to navigate the complexities of the French court while subtly promoting Austrian perspectives, a difficult balancing act that ultimately contributed to her downfall. Other daughters of Maria Theresa were similarly deployed. Maria Carolina became Queen of Naples and Sicily, where she exercised significant influence, especially after the death of her husband. She aligned herself with British naval power and formed a strong alliance with Lord Nelson, using her position to push back against revolutionary France and protect dynastic interests in southern Europe. Her political acumen, fierce will, and anti-French stance made her a formidable player, earning both admiration and fear in equal measure. Within the Viennese court itself, queens and consorts frequently influenced the selection of advisors, the shaping of policy, and the outcomes of court factions. Though they rarely issued edicts, their preferences and recommendations held weight, particularly when supported by loyal factions of nobility or clergy. Archduchess Sophie, mother of Emperor Franz Joseph, wielded considerable authority even after her son took the throne. A staunch conservative and symbol of dynastic continuity, she dominated court politics, marginalized her daughter-in-law Empress Elizabeth, and shaped imperial attitudes toward liberalism and nationalism. Queens and consorts often used their roles as cultural and religious patrons to strengthen their political positions. By aligning themselves with influential bishops, Jesuit scholars, or cultural elites, they could reinforce their legitimacy and forge alliances across institutional divides. Their support for certain monastic orders or charitable projects was rarely apolitical. It was part of a broader effort to build networks of loyalty and influence within and beyond the court. Foreign diplomacy was another sphere in which queenly influence, though indirect, was unmistakable. Through correspondence with family members across Europe, queens often served as intermediaries during times of crisis or negotiation. Letters exchanged between royal sisters, mothers, and daughters were full of political intelligence, personal assessments of foreign courts, and strategic suggestions. These communications allowed queens to maintain a sense of control and relevance even when physically removed from their place of birth or origin. They also enabled dynastic families to synchronize responses to external threats, manage intermarriage negotiations, and coordinate diplomatic gestures. Marriage diplomacy, arranging, negotiating, and leveraging matrimonial alliances, was arguably the most important domain in which royal women exerted long-term political influence. As both subjects and architects of these unions, queens understood their dynastic purpose and worked to ensure their success or renegotiation when necessary. They often played crucial roles in mentoring the next generation of royal brides, preparing them for their roles and instilling in them a sense of duty to their natal family's interests. Even in times of political upheaval, queens found ways to assert their influence. Empress Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Habsburg empress, demonstrated remarkable political insight during World War I. Fluent in multiple languages and trained in diplomacy, she participated actively in her husband Emperor Charles I's attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies. Her correspondence with her brothers, who were prominent figures in Allied countries, became part of these back-channel efforts. Though ultimately unsuccessful, her role underscores the continued relevance of queenly diplomacy even in the empire's twilight years. The very act of remaining in the political background often amplified a queen's effectiveness. Their advice was sometimes heeded more closely because it came without the threat of overt authority. A well-placed suggestion or a quiet warning could influence emperors in ways that public confrontation could not. Moreover, because their power was unofficial, queens could shift allegiances more fluidly, build coalitions across competing factions, and act as stabilizing forces during succession crises or court scandals. Yet this influence was always conditional and fragile. A queen's ability to maneuver depended heavily on her personal relationships, health, and the stability of her marriage or children's status. Falling out of favor could mean isolation or exile, and the same networks that supported her influence could be turned against her. Political rivalries among women at court, between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, between reigning and dowager queens, could quickly erupt into power struggles that threatened both family and state. Still, the pattern is undeniable. Throughout Habsburg history, queens and consorts found ways to shape politics, sometimes profoundly, through roles that were ostensibly ornamental or secondary. They did so not through decrees or titles, but through persuasion, observation, and connection. They read people as astutely as they read treaties, and they learned to navigate a world where their power was real, if always contingent. Their legacy is visible not in monuments or military victories, but in the enduring survival of the Habsburg dynasty across centuries of upheaval. They sustained fragile alliances, advised wavering rulers, calmed internal dissent, and ensured the continuity of one of Europe's most complex empires. Theirs was the quiet power of influence, persistent, elusive, and ultimately indispensable. The Habsburg dynasty, often associated with grandeur, tradition, and elaborate court rituals, was also marked by profound personal tragedies, many of which unfolded behind gilded doors and within tightly controlled social frameworks. Beneath the surface of public splendor lay a fragile human reality shaped by isolation, emotional repression, and immense pressure to uphold dynastic ideals. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the episodes of mental illness and suicide that cast long shadows over the imperial family, revealing a hidden undercurrent of pain and vulnerability. These episodes did not only impact the individuals directly involved, they deeply affected the queens and empresses who witnessed, endured, or were pulled into the aftermath. Mental illness carried a heavy stigma within aristocratic circles, especially in the tightly conservative and Catholic Habsburg court. It was rarely spoken about openly, and those who showed signs of psychological distress were often isolated or subject to extreme interventions that only heightened their suffering. The need to maintain appearances both domestically and on the international stage meant that emotional fragility had to be concealed or denied altogether. For women, especially queens, this silence was even more rigid. They were expected to be the emotional and moral backbone of the family, upholding poise and devotion while often being denied any outlet for their own struggles. Few events in Habsburg history reveal the weight of this emotional suppression more starkly than the Mayerling incident in 1889. Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth Sisi, was found dead alongside his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, at the Imperial hunting lodge in Mayerling. The official story declared it a joint suicide, a murder-suicide carried out by Rudolf in a state of despair and emotional instability. Yet for years, conspiracy theories, conflicting reports, and state-managed cover-ups clouded the truth. The imperial court, deeply shaken by the tragedy, did everything in its power to minimize scandal and preserve the image of the monarchy. Rudolf had been known to struggle with depression, alcohol abuse, and a sense of political and personal disillusionment. His liberal ideals clashed with his father's rigid conservatism, and his strained relationship with both parents left him emotionally adrift. He was also deeply burdened by the expectations placed upon him as the heir to a vast empire. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium had deteriorated, and he found in Mary Wetzera a companion willing to embrace his fatalistic worldview. Their final act at Mayerling was both a cry of despair and a symbolic rejection of the constraints that had defined their lives. For Empress Elizabeth, Rudolf's suicide was a psychological wound from which she never recovered. Already prone to melancholia and detachment, the death of her only son plunged her into deeper isolation. Her previous bouts of depression intensified, and she withdrew almost entirely from court life, traveling incessantly to escape her grief and avoid the oppressive atmosphere of the Viennese court. Sisi had always been an elusive figure haunted by personal loss, obsessed with beauty and control, and estranged from her husband's political world. Rudolf's death confirmed her worst fears about the suffocating effects of court life, and it deepened her emotional exile from the empire she once reluctantly served. Other women in the imperial family also bore the weight of this tragedy in different ways. Crown Princess Stephanie, Rudolf's widow, was left to cope not only with the trauma of losing her husband but with the humiliation of being publicly associated with scandal and abandonment. She was effectively cast out of the inner circle of the court and lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity, her role reduced from future empress to social exile. The incident demonstrated the way in which queens and consorts could be simultaneously peripheral to and trapped within dynastic catastrophe, present, affected, but often powerless. The Mayerling tragedy was not an isolated incident in Habsburg history. The emotional legacy of the dynasty, riddled with pressures to conform, suppress, and obey, created an environment in which mental illness could fester unchecked. Earlier generations also faced emotional trauma in silence. Empress Maria Theresa, though a formidable ruler, experienced profound grief over the deaths of several of her children, often interpreting these losses through a religious lens that both consoled and burdened her. Her expressions of grief were private, folded into her sense of maternal and Catholic duty, but her letters betray a woman constantly contending with sorrow beneath her imperious facade. Suicide, in particular, remained a taboo subject, both a sin in the eyes of the Church and a dishonor to imperial legacy. When it occurred, as in the case of Rudolf, it was swiftly sanitized in official records, and any associated guilt was redirected or erased. Yet for the women closest to these tragedies, the consequences were lifelong. They were left to reconcile public roles with private heartbreak, often without the space or permission to mourn openly. In a court culture built on hierarchy, ritual, and emotional restraint, the psychological toll was immense. Queens were expected to personify strength and endurance while internalizing pain that could not be expressed. This forced resilience often came at the cost of their mental well-being, and when family members faltered through illness, scandal, or suicide, they became the silent bearers of shame and grief. Their responses, though muted in official histories, speak volumes about the fragility of power when it intersects with human suffering. The tragedies that unfolded within the Habsburg family remind us that no amount of royal protocol could shield individuals from the vulnerabilities of the human condition. Behind every portrait of poise and power stood women who bore the emotional consequences of dynastic ambition and the silence imposed by social norms. Their mourning was often private, their pain buried beneath veils of etiquette and duty, but their stories, when read closely, reveal the emotional cost of empire. The legacy of the Habsburg dynasty is not only etched into the political and cultural history of Europe but also physically imprinted on the faces of its members. One of the most distinctive and infamous traits associated with the family is the so-called Habsburg chin, a prominent jaw and lower lip resulting from centuries of intermarriage among close relatives. This physical characteristic, once a symbol of dynastic purity and lineage, eventually came to embody the hidden personal and medical costs of a rigid adherence to political marriages aimed at preserving bloodlines. For queens and their children, especially those expected to produce heirs and project the physical ideal of royal elegance, the consequences were far more than cosmetic. They endured both the emotional burden of public scrutiny and the very real health complications that stemmed from genetic inbreeding. The strategy of intermarriage was central to Habsburg's survival. As a dynasty that stretched across much of Europe, the Habsburgs consolidated power through carefully arranged marriages, often between cousins, uncles, nieces, and other close relations. This policy of endogamy aimed to preserve territory, alliances, and claims to thrones, but it also led to a dangerous accumulation of genetic mutations. Over generations, these unions increased the likelihood of hereditary defects, including not just the protruding jaw but more serious conditions such as epilepsy, infertility, and various developmental disorders. While kings and emperors often bore the visible signs of these genetic legacies, queens, many of whom came from outside the family, faced a unique form of tension. They were expected to produce healthy male heirs while also integrating into a family whose hereditary conditions were increasingly well known. Marrying into the Habsburg line meant accepting the risk of transmitting these defects to one's children, and it also meant enduring a level of scrutiny that was especially acute for royal women. Their physical appearance, fertility, and the perceived health of their offspring became matters of political and public concern. Any deviation from the expected norm was not merely a personal concern, it was treated as a flaw in the state itself. Perhaps the most well-known case of genetic decline within the Habsburgs culminated in the person of Charles II of Spain, who reigned in the late 17th century. Born from generations of inbreeding, Charles suffered from a host of debilitating health issues. He was physically frail, mentally impaired, and reportedly incapable of producing an heir, though he was married twice. His pronounced mandibular prognathism, the Habsburg jaw, was one of many symptoms of his family's genetic stagnation. Though Charles's condition was extreme, the precedent he set became a cautionary tale of what could happen when dynastic ideology overrode basic biological considerations. Queens who married into this legacy often lived in fear that their children might inherit or manifest similar traits. Even those queens not directly affected physically often suffered emotionally. They watched their children grow up with developmental delays or chronic illnesses, knowing that little could be done to address or even publicly acknowledge the issues. In the Habsburg court, medical problems were often hidden or downplayed, both out of personal pride and dynastic necessity. Public admission of infirmity, especially in male heirs, was seen as a threat to the stability of succession and the prestige of the monarchy. This secrecy placed queens in a deeply conflicted role. They were expected to be nurturing mothers while simultaneously upholding the fiction of perfect health and vitality in their children. The burden of responsibility and guilt could be profound. Some queens blamed themselves either for failing to produce strong heirs or for introducing new, weaker genetic strains into the dynasty. Others faced criticism or exile if they were believed to have compromised the lineage. When marriages failed to yield healthy children, it was often the queens who bore the brunt of societal judgment, even though the underlying genetic problems were a direct result of the Habsburgs' own long-standing policies. The emotional toll of these expectations was exacerbated by the absence of meaningful medical understanding or psychological support. Conditions like infertility or miscarriage were poorly understood and often attributed to personal failings or divine punishment. Women who suffered multiple stillbirths or lost children in infancy were frequently seen as cursed or inadequate, despite the clear pattern of hereditary frailty within the family. Their suffering remained private, concealed beneath the rigid decorum of court life. In time, the very traits that once signified dynastic purity began to inspire ridicule and fear. Caricatures of Habsburg rulers exaggerated their chins and jaws to the point of grotesque parody, turning once royal features into symbols of decadence and decline. This shift in perception was particularly harsh for queens and princesses, whose beauty and elegance were central to their political utility. To be associated with the Habsburg deformity was to risk becoming the object of mockery or suspicion, undermining both personal dignity and public image. The Habsburg chin became a metaphor for the dangers of prioritizing power over well-being. For queens, it was more than a facial feature, it was a constant reminder of the unnatural demands placed on their bodies and their families. They lived at the intersection of biology and ideology, navigating a world where love, health, and personal choice were often sacrificed for the sake of political continuity. Their legacy, often overshadowed by the more visible male figures of the dynasty, includes not only the public roles they fulfilled but also the private toll they endured in a system that prized bloodline above all else. The fall of the Habsburg monarchy in the wake of World War I marked a dramatic turning point not only in European political history but also in the lives of the women who had once occupied the empire's most prestigious yet tightly confined roles. The queens, empresses, and consorts of the Habsburg line had long been cast in supporting parts on the grand stage of dynastic politics, their power often indirect but deeply influential. As the final curtain fell on centuries of Habsburg rule, these women were faced with a dual reckoning: the end of the world they had known and the beginning of their transformation into historical symbols sometimes revered, sometimes erased, and often misunderstood. The abrupt collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918 following its defeat in World War I was catastrophic for the Habsburg family. Emperor Charles I and Empress Zita of Bourbon-Parma found themselves suddenly stripped of their titles, banished from court, and exiled from Austria. For Zita, the last reigning Habsburg empress, the transition from imperial matriarch to refugee was both jarring and defining. Having embraced her role with conviction and religious fervor, Zita continued to behave with royal dignity even in the most reduced circumstances. She refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Austrian Republic and insisted that her children be raised with a full awareness of their heritage and responsibilities. Zita's response to the monarchy's fall was marked by resilience and quiet determination. She accompanied her husband into exile in Switzerland and then Madeira, where Charles died in 1922 at the age of 34. Widowed and left with 8 children, Zita wore black for the rest of her life and took up the cause of preserving the legacy of the Habsburg family. She worked tirelessly to keep alive the memory of the monarchy, not merely as a nostalgic fantasy, but as a moral and spiritual mission rooted in the divine right she believed her husband and children possessed. Her later years were spent advocating for the beatification of Charles, attempting to rehabilitate the reputation of the Habsburg monarchy as benevolent and misunderstood rather than outdated and oppressive. Other Habsburg women, too, responded to the collapse of the empire with varying degrees of sorrow, practicality, and adaptation. Many faced financial ruin, social alienation, and political suspicion. The fall of the monarchy rendered them both politically obsolete and historically vulnerable. Without the protections of court life, their identities were left in limbo, once empresses and archduchesses now reduced to symbols of a lost world. In many cases, their stories faded into obscurity, buried beneath the rubble of revolution and the rewriting of European history that followed the war. For decades after the empire's fall, the role of Habsburg women was largely neglected or romanticized in popular memory. Historians focused on emperors, generals, and political treaties, leaving little room for the nuanced contributions of queens and empresses. When remembered, they were often reduced to stereotypes: the tragic beauty, the meddling mother-in-law, the devout Catholic. These reductive portrayals did not account for the political diplomacy, cultural patronage, and personal sacrifices that defined their lives. Figures like Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, were turned into mythic characters in film and literature, with little concern for historical accuracy. The deeper emotional and political currents that shaped their choices were lost beneath the glossy surface of popular storytelling. In the decades that followed, however, the process of historical whitewashing began to unravel, and a more critical reassessment of the Habsburg women emerged. Scholars started to revisit the private correspondence, diaries, and personal archives that had long been overlooked or dismissed. These documents revealed complex individuals who had navigated the contradictions of power, gender, and duty with remarkable intelligence and agency. They were not merely the decorative accessories of the imperial machine, they were its quiet engineers, shaping court culture, diplomacy, and even foreign policy through relationships, persuasion, and informal influence. The rehabilitation of women like Zita has been part of this broader trend. Rather than dismissing her post-imperial advocacy as stubborn nostalgia, modern scholars have come to view her actions as strategic attempts to shape historical memory. Zita's campaigns to canonize Charles, her efforts to maintain contact with loyalist factions across Europe, and her insistence on her family's dynastic legitimacy reflected a sophisticated understanding of symbolism and legacy. She used religion, ritual, and public narrative as tools of political endurance, ensuring that the Habsburg story did not vanish even after its empire had collapsed. More broadly, the renewed attention to Habsburg queens has helped to illuminate the gendered nature of historical erasure. These women operated within a patriarchal system that both elevated and silenced them, granting them proximity to power while denying them formal authority. Their influence was real but often informal, exercised through court patronage, marriage diplomacy, and maternal guidance. As a result, their contributions were easily minimized or misattributed. The post-imperial period, with its modernizing ideologies and anti-monarchist sentiments, was particularly unkind to their reputations. Yet the very marginalization they experienced has made their legacies more potent for contemporary reflection. Today their stories are being reclaimed not just as footnotes in dynastic history, but as vital narratives that offer insight into the intersections of gender, power, and identity within one of Europe's most enduring royal families. Museums, academic studies, and documentaries now explore their lives with greater depth and empathy. The queens who once seemed frozen in formality have re-emerged as flesh and blood figures, ambitious, conflicted, devout, and defiant. The end of the Habsburg monarchy did not spell the end of its queen's relevance. Instead, it opened the door for reinterpretation, for a more honest and multifaceted understanding of who they were and what they endured. They were the witnesses to empire and its fall, the custodians of memory, and the human faces behind dynastic decline. In their sorrow, perseverance, and complex legacies, the final queens of the Habsburg line remind us that the echoes of power often linger long after the throne has been vacated. The women of the Habsburg dynasty have long been presented through a narrow lens, shaped by centuries of tradition, myth-making, and selective memory. Too often their roles have been reduced to silent support for powerful men, ornamental presences in portraits, or tragic figures bound by duty and sorrow. But when their stories are examined closely through letters, diaries, political actions, and the cultural legacies they left behind, these queens and empresses emerge as deeply complex individuals navigating a world of extraordinary constraints and expectations. Reclaiming their narratives is not just an act of historical correction. It is a redefinition of what royal womanhood meant in a world that simultaneously exalted and confined them. Their lives, often lived in gilded cages, were shaped by dynastic imperatives that denied them personal agency even as they demanded strength, resilience, and intellect. And yet, many of these women exerted power subtly, strategically, and often behind closed doors. From Maria Theresa, who ruled in her own right and reshaped the Austrian Empire, to Zita, who sustained the Habsburg legacy in exile, these queens were not merely passive participants in their husbands' legacies. They were decision-makers, cultural patrons, mothers, diplomats, and political actors in their own right. Even those with less formal influence contributed significantly to court life, religion, and the emotional stability of imperial families, often at great personal cost. In modern discussions of gender and power, the Habsburg queens offer valuable insight into the limitations and possibilities of women operating within patriarchal structures. Their stories mirror the wider struggles faced by women across history: how to assert identity in systems that deny it, how to balance public expectation with private desire, and how to use whatever influence is available to affect change, even in constrained environments. Their experiences with mental health, body politics, fertility, and societal judgment remain strikingly relevant today, revealing how little has changed in the scrutiny of women's bodies, emotions, and roles. Their creativity and intellect, once dismissed or downplayed, now stand as reminders of the agency women have always found, even in silence. Moreover, these stories challenge us to think differently about history itself, about who is remembered, who is forgotten, and why. The exclusion of these queens from traditional narratives is not an accident but a reflection of deeper biases in how history has been written and who has written it. By centering their voices and perspectives, we enrich our understanding of empire, politics, and culture. We also gain a more honest, multifaceted picture of monarchy, one that accounts for both its pageantry and its pain. These women were not always saints or martyrs, they were human, full of contradiction, ambition, and vulnerability. It is in that humanity that their true legacy lies. What we've missed by not fully hearing their stories is not just the drama of palace intrigue or the spectacle of royal life. We've missed the chance to see how women shaped the course of European history, often from the margins. We've missed the emotional texture of an empire seen through maternal eyes, the quiet resistance and acts of personal defiance, the sadness woven into silks and protocols. To recover these stories is to not only honor their lives but to question the very foundations of historical narrative: who gets to be the protagonist, and who is relegated to the background. In telling these stories now with nuance and depth, we are not just rewriting the history of the Habsburg queens. We are reimagining what it means to be remembered. And in doing so, we restore to these women the dignity of complexity, the power of voice, and the recognition long denied them.